You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So Jim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Michael. Thank you for having me on the Edge of Faith.
Sure, absolutely. So, Jim, you're a neurotheologian, so that's a mouthful. So maybe for some of the listeners that aren't sure what that is, could you explain a little bit of that and what it entails?
Sure. It's really a very old field. It started with Nemesius, who was the bishop of Emesa in the year 390, because he was of the opinion that God who created the Bible and God who created the body were the same, and so the two things should work together. So he's well known for things like being at least the co-discoverer that the heart pumps blood around the body, and he started also to believe that the different parts of the brain affected who we were as people and our characteristics. And so for over 1,500 years, his book on the body was sort of the leading discovery. And then in the last half century, probably, we've been learning a whole lot more about the brain and continuing the same kind of thinking that Nemesius had. We put together what are the instructions that God gives for how to run a human brain with what we can discover through science of how it was created to run. Can you get the optimal performance? And the optimal performance is a brain that is fully human. It's just the way it was designed to be. So I've got a degree in psychology, a background in neuroscience, and a degree in theology. And so putting those two things together and comparing notes makes for a interesting way of looking at humans. I think would be the sort of neurotheology background that I'd give. It's not a definition probably, but
that works great.
Last I checked, about 2,000 websites that refer to neurotheology, so it's not quite as obscure as some people might think it is.
No, in fact, I think we've interviewed a few here on the show, but it's a fascinating discipline, actually. Although I'd have to say now, after listening to your explanation, it makes me wonder if maybe that's the discipline where we got the phrase, God gave you a brain for a reason.
I hope it is, yes.
So
I know I've been asked very often when I came to church with my brain diagrams, what does the brain have to do with being a Christian? So apparently some people have lost track of the connection between the two, but
absolutely.
I love to explore it.
So onto your book, Renovate, God, Dallas Willard, and the Church That Transforms. Could you tell us a little bit about the book and the events and inspiration leading up to it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting sort of formative passage. You know, when I went to graduate school back in the 70s, everything was eclectic, and it was pick and choose whatever you could find from here and there that might work. And you kind of put that together in the practice of psychology. And I was sent to train at a center in Van Nuys, California called Shepherd's House, where Jane Willard was one of my early trainers, supervisors. And Jane Willard is Dallas Willard's wife, and she has a degree in counseling. And so she's very interested in putting together what was being developed in terms of spiritual formation and spiritual disciplines with what we were learning in terms of counseling practice. And so over the decades, we would interweave the two of them, and each had their sort of deficits, you might say. The spiritual disciplines worked intermittently. They work really well for some people and not well for people with trauma backgrounds. and our trauma recovery worked intermittently with some people. Some people did very well with it, and other people couldn't seem to connect it with their spiritual life at all. So we started trying to figure out, again, back to the question, if we were trying to develop people the way God meant them to be, shouldn't what the church is doing and what spiritual disciplines are doing and what counselors are doing weave together in some kind of a formula? So, and that kind of became the basis for the dialogue, and we gathered a group of about 30 leaders of both church and theology and counseling practices together to try to come up with some answers, sort of a unified theory, you might say, of how you should grow a human being. And out of that dialogue, we invited Dallas to give a conference where he presented the theology part of it, and various neurotheologian type speakers would present the psychology development, and try to come up with a sense of how do you actually transform character so that it looks Christ-like, and how does that fit with how people are meant to grow up? So it became the start of a really interesting dialogue that's continued. That was in 2012, so we're now 8 years past sort of the public launch of that, and finally we have the book coming out now that kind of outlines the basis for the discussion.
Right, which I guess, you covered that a little bit in the book, that Dallas just knew he wasn't going to have time to write anything on it himself, right?
Well, yes, he at the time that we had the conference, we didn't know that yet. He was still being diagnosed with disease that ultimately took his life, but he proposed that in the next year or two we'd work together, but then that didn't happen just because of medical and health constraints, and then we lost Dallas. So lesser minds must continue on their own, I guess.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. But so, I guess the next question is, and you're touching on it already in this last answer about, our focus on being Christ-like. And this book has a little bit of a paradigm shift on how to accomplish that. Could you maybe go in a little deeper into the book and kind of explain a little bit about what that is and what the book's purpose is for?
Yeah, the goal is something everyone agrees with, but then what is it? What are the steps to actually develop Christian character? And about 500 years back, of course, we hit the Enlightenment, which had many things going for it, but there was a formative book that came out by Antonio Damasio in the 1990s called, talking about the error of the Enlightenment. It was called Descartes' Error. Descartes was sort of the foundational person who said, "I think, therefore I am." And it made thinking the number one characteristic, let's say, of human beings, the most important one. And since then, theology and culture have gone in the direction of what I think and believe and the choices I make are the main tools for character change. Well, along comes brain science, and it says we're not much changed by what we think or believe. In fact, if you were to compare the brain with a tree, our beliefs and thinking are up in the leaf area. They're way up at the top. They wave around. They're easy to change. But our roots of our identity are down in the attachment section. So who we love has a huge impact on who we turn out to be. And what we believe is much more easily swayed and changed. So most of the Christian tools have been in the study, think, get the right ideas, believe, and make better choices department, which, as far as the brain is concerned, is a fairly flimsy modality, and not very strongly in the let's learn to know God, think with God, love God, form a really emotional, relational attachment to Him. And if we did that, we would be actually touching on the circuits in the brain that form our character and allow us to change it. So the discussion then in the book is, how do you put those two things together? Because obviously we want to think and believe the right ideas. It wouldn't do it all to be wrong and believing lies. And on the other hand, how do we use the power of attachment and love to really profoundly change our character? So that's where we get down to churches that transform. And it was the objective that counselors had and the objective that Dallas had. Both sides wanted to see people, profoundly transformed. So we're proposing that we as Christians should invest a whole lot more interest and energy in our relational capacities with God and with others if we really want to see changes in our spiritual life.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. Beautiful, really. As I was reading the book, I came up to chapter 3, which has the title Thinking with God, and I found, really, I've got a couple of questions for you, but we'll start with the first one, I guess. I found it really interesting. You were talking about trauma, and normally when I'm thinking in terms of trauma, I just think of the negative things that happen to individuals, severe negative things. But you discuss an additional cause, which is when crucial good things don't happen. And I thought that was, I don't know why the sentence took me so much, but I was fascinated by it. So I was hoping maybe you could elaborate on that, on these trauma concepts just a little bit.
Yeah. Going back to the area of the late 70s, early 80s, there was a bus full of children buried alive in California as an abduction, and as a result of that, people started really studying trauma and trying to notice its effects. And the thing that we noticed after looking at it for a while is that the same bad thing could happen to two people, and one of them would end up being traumatized, the other one might not. So there was some other factor at work that you would have to call sort of a strength of personality or something like that. Some people came into traumas with much stronger personalities that didn't, break as easily. And so we began to wonder what that was, and the number one factor was a strong attachment to at least two people in your life as you were growing up. So if you had two people that you could really rely would be with you through anything, it was much harder to cause the same degree of damage if you had an external trauma, bad thing that happened. But then we began to look at the people who did not have anyone to love them, and 100% of them ended up with damage. So the lack of important love connections, lack of anybody who would enjoy you, caused damage to 100% of the people, whereas having, like a terrible assault or something like that did not traumatize everybody. It only traumatized those who lacked those kind of powerful connections. So in the end, we concluded that the absence of the necessary good things was 100% damaging, whereas bad things that happened to you, for instance, Jesus never had to go through therapy as a result of the crucifixion. So, the 3 days in the tomb were not an advanced therapy session with God to try to get him through his trauma. He suffered, but he wasn't traumatized by it. All the way through, he continues to act like the same person he was all the rest of his life. So you see the difference there between trauma and suffering. He stayed relational. He continued to talk to his mother, his best friend, God his father throughout the event. In fact, he's even trying to win over the people who are crucifying him as he goes along. Very relational, not traumatized at all, but we all know very deep suffering there. So those kind of attachments become the things that need repair, that we need to be connected with other people and with God if we're going to have the resilience we need to display Christian character. So we began very interested in rebuilding what had been missing in people's lives. And I hope that sort of comes together for you as I'm
Absolutely.
explaining it.
That's fascinating. It makes me wonder how, when you mention like when people didn't experience someone that loved them and that caused severe trauma 100% of the time, that's really a giant testimony to how incredibly hardwired we are to be relational, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's the central part. Dr. Alan Shore from UCLA, who basically studied how do you develop a human identity, said the basic element in developing a human brain is that you have to be the sparkle in someone's eye. Someone has to be delighted to be with you. That relational connection, or the brain just doesn't develop in a human kind of a way. It starts to morph into dangerous and unhelpful constellations, you might say, in the absence of joy and human love.
Wow. Okay, so I guess I better jump into the next question. Still related to this chapter, and actually, at least I'm being focused now. It's related to the probably primary idea of the chapter, Thinking with God, is where you get into the concept of mutual mind or intersubjectivity. Could you go into this subject a little more detail and how this works relationally for humans, and then how we as humans can develop that kind of mutual mind with God?
Yes, it to me is very fascinating. Of course, almost all of the spiritual formation people speak about, have calendars about the with God life is how they put it. So thinking with God hasn't been the big focus there. It's more been thinking about God.
Mm-hmm.
But I was sitting in one of Alan Shore's lectures at one point, and he was talking about this intersubjectivity, this mutual mind, and he was saying that if you're face-to-face with another human being, the nonverbal communication, we would call it, goes back and forth between the two brains 6 times per second, so that we actually begin to think and feel the same thing as the other mind is thinking and feeling at the same time that they're thinking it. And it produces in the growing brain the same chemistry, and it even grows a matching brain structure to the one you match. You're in a mutual mind state. He says that's how little babies about age 5 months develop a human brain, by being in this mutual mind state. And they begin to think and act and understand the other mind they're interacting with. And since I already had an interest in neurotheology, I thought to myself immediately, I wonder whether or not God wants to think with us about life. If we have the capacity to think together in a mutual mind state with another human being in real time, what are the odds that God doesn't want to do that? And if that's the system that develops our identity, then wouldn't thinking with God be the way that you'd form a Christ-like character? You'd like, I understand what he's thinking. And all of us have friends or family members. You look at them and they look at us, and we know what the other person is thinking right on the spot. And we sometimes joke and say, are you thinking what I'm thinking? And all of this very, very fast communication is what produces this mutual mind state. And then if we stop and notice it, we can notice, what mind we're interacting with. So if God uses this mutual mind state, then we should be able to stop and notice thoughts that are happening in our minds that might have God on the other side. But mutual mind states have a peculiar characteristic, you might say, and that is that at the time, because they're mutual, you can't tell if it's me thinking it or you thinking it. So an example of that would be if someone starts smiling at you or you start smiling at them, we're never quite sure what. Both people would say to the other, well, you're making me smile. No, they'd say, you're making me smile because we are making us smile. It's mutual. We don't notice that so much as when it's like anger, and so suddenly someone is mad at us, we're mad at them, and we would say to them, well, you're making me mad. And they say, no, you're making me mad. And it turns into a really great fight because we made us mad. It was a mutual mind state amplifying. All mutual mind states amplify whatever emotion that you're sharing between the two of you. And so here we're in this, suddenly heated state. It takes less than 10 seconds to go from zero to full blast in those states. And we've all experienced them. And we've all seen people argue about, who's doing what to who when they're actually doing it together. So suppose God was also amplifying with us his thoughts. We wouldn't know at the moment whether they were his thoughts or our thoughts. It would be a mutual mind state. But when we stop to look back on them, we would go, wow, that would be the way God would think about it. And, of course, the more we would think like God, the less you could tell the difference between the two. So then when people are trying to figure out, well, did God tell me about that song? Did God give me that picture? Did God bring this thought to my mind? Did God, when I was reading the scriptures, was that God or was that me? We can't tell. Because in mutual mind states, the characteristic is we were doing it together. But I've heard that kind of discussion among creative people for years and years and years. God gave me this thought, or was it my thought? How do I attribute it? And yet it's evidence that we see almost in every creative adventure, every song we hear at church, every sermon, that something about this happened with God and us thinking together in a way that happens so fast that we really can't tell who did what. And yet when we look back, we see it's got a little bit of us and a little bit of God in the mix. Now, that would be a good way to live most of our life is how we're thinking about it.
That's wonderful. Listening to the whole thing, it's kind of entertaining to me on the fact that I'm thinking about, science and God really haven't, or science and Christians, I should say, sorry. Science and Christians really haven't got along that well the last, 600 years or so. But I've always found that was interesting in the fact that, the first scientists were priests, and it was the love of God and his creation that brought us to science. And now we're talking about how science, or the understanding it brings us, can bring us closer to God. So I guess it always comes back in a circle, doesn't it?
I'm hoping it does, and that's certainly been the evidence we've seen, that there's a beautiful harmony between the things that God tells us we should be doing, the way God thinks, and the way the brain is designed to run best.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're the founder of Life Model Works, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that ministry?
Sure. Again, going back to the 1970s and 80s, and trying to figure out a model for how life actually works. So you could use the same model for dealing with addictions or raising children, deciding how to plant a church, doing brain surgery, deciding what medication somebody needed. All of those things, when you stop and look at them, are how do we develop a human community? And so the same theory should explain all of them without contradicting itself. It would expand into different areas, but that was a model for life, you see. And then we thought, well, it should work for babies as well as 90-year-olds. And so the elements that came together for us were three kind of distinctive things. One is a multi-generational model of human communities. It takes about 4 generations working together to create a working human being. The second was what we call an Emmanuel lifestyle, and that is, unless you bring in something from God, you end up with human beings that are nice, but they're like everybody else. They're not like Jesus at all. So you actually have to have an Emmanuel, a way of practicing God's presence that informs the way you think, so that you can see in people not just who they've been, but who God wants them to be. So as a community, we can actually call out and develop who we're going to be eternally. And who we're going to be eternally is something that should start right now. It's a very, very important thing for Dallas Willard. He said, that we're eternal beings, and we're not just here waiting to die as miserable sinners. We're beginning to become who we're supposed to be. So that was the second element in that. And then the third one was, you actually have to train your brain. It has to learn how to be human, and it has to learn how to be Christ-like. So there's actually brain relational skills that have to be learned. And if you don't have the skill, you can't, for instance, if you don't have the brain skill for mindsight, being able to do this thinking with another person, you can't read any people any better than you can read ancient Hebrew or Greek to look at the biblical text. And we have to learn things in order to be able to read the biblical text. We have to learn things in order to be able to operate relationally. And so as a Christian community, we should actually be teaching each other these relational skills. How to love right specifically at those times when it's not working well. And so the life model works is a place in which we gather people that are interested in working on that together. We set up teams with the objective, actually, of reaching the 2.2 billion Christians in the world, which is about 1 out of 4 people. If 1 out of 4 people was teaching relational joy skills to all their community around them, we would be in a fundamentally different kind of a planet. And so this relational way of being, of experiencing God and expressing that to others in multi-generational communities is what we gather the resources, the people who think and practice, and then we try to get that into existing networks. We don't want to be the next church or mission or anything like that. We just want to equip everybody who's already out there with what might be missing from their portfolio on relational skills, so that they can be more effective with that. And since I know that you deal with artists a little bit over on the Edge of Faith, I would like to say that for 20 years we've been waiting for the artists to arrive, because this won't actually permeate culture until the artists arrive to carry the message. So if any artists feel like this is their calling, we've been waiting for them.
That's wonderful. Well, hopefully a few of them will hear and come that way. That's wonderful. I think we're almost out of time, so do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave the listeners of Edge of Faith?
Yes, I think so. Dallas used loving our enemies as a benchmark for Christian character and maturity. And so divine love is a relational attachment to that other person. Then our observation is that building relational attachment love to our enemies, so we're just putting those things together. We're actually relating to and attaching to the people that don't like us. That's the exercises that build Christian character and maturity. If that's what we're heading for, that would be the workout right there, learning to love people that don't like us. And you really can't do that by yourself. So we have to be with others who can help us to see people the way God sees them. At the moment, we don't feel like we like them very much. So when we see them that way and help each other, it's sort of a mutual mind with God and with other people who are on the same journey with us at the same time. So when my connection with God breaks down, I can borrow your connection with God to continue to help and realize, this is a person that God loves. The fact that they don't like me only means that they're not seeing me like God does. And so if Christians were working together as communities to love their enemies, it would make all of us at the Life Model Works and our community very, very happy. I'd just like to invite people to think about how they could be involved in spreading this love, this attachment and love of God to the people who know it least. So thank you for letting me share these thoughts, for mentioning the book and inviting me to be a part of the Edge of Faith.
Absolutely. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I hope we can definitely bring the love of God into the world again. It's a great message today. It's very divisive, and there's really no need.
Yeah, exactly. Though it's not going to be an easy path forward, learning to love relationally, and that's why we need each other.
Absolutely. All right, sir. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a joy being on your program.